This is Bucky Stanton, and welcome to Technology Storytellers, brought to you by the Society for the History of Technology. Today I speak with Dr. Lundy Braun, Professor of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine and Africana Studies at Brown University. She's also author of Breathing Race into the Machine, The Surprising Career of the Spirometer from Plantation to Genetics. Lundy discusses her interdisciplinary background, the scientific history of measuring racial difference through lung capacity, and how to respond to a world of implicit and explicit scientific and technical racial biases. How'd you get into this project? What's the story behind this kind of interdisciplinary approach and book?
Okay, so the story is utterly serendipitous, and so I think in some ways it's a useful lesson. That's a strong word, but to pay attention to things outside what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So at the time that I was first beginning this project, I was teaching pathology to medical students. Ann Foster Sterling was organizing a science and technology program at Brown, and I was invited to participate in the race and science workshop that Evelyn Hammonds organized at first at MIT and then at Harvard. And so I was sort of blessed in a way that those three things happened at the same time. I mean, there's a lot of attention to racial disparities in disease right now, but this was back in 1999, and medical students I had then were already raising those questions. So that's important in terms of understanding quite how deep the commitment is to addressing racial disparities among medical students in particular. And actually a question from a medical student got me going on really my first paper on the topic. But how I came to study the spirometer, I was not thinking technological machines, I was actually more focused on lung capacity measurements, the measurements that are done. And I was reading the Providence Journal one morning before going off to work, and I came across this short article, and it discussed that the Owens Corning, the asbestos manufacturer involved in a big lawsuit in Baltimore, was arguing for race correction of lung capacity measurements for Black former asbestos workers who were trying to get compensated. And I just looked at it, and it seemed so strange to me, the idea of race correction. And now it's become pretty common. In fact, race correction is proliferating in medicine rather than declining. I think maybe this will change soon, hopefully, but so I was just reading this article and I cut it out, and I mentioned it at the race workshop, and I also mentioned it to a good friend who's an occupational physician, and he's a very meticulous researcher. He gave me a whole list of articles, including the papers that had been highlighted. And indeed, this was a normative practice in medicine to correct for race. And, I still wasn't thinking of the machine particularly. That started to come out in conversations with Ann Foster Sterling in particular. But it sort of emerged from the research that over time that I had to really think about the machine that was producing these measurements and how, first, why was race there? How did it get there? That was a key question that I posed very early in the project. And then how was it explained? So it was trying to get more at this issue of just documenting difference without explaining difference.
Yeah, and could you just lay out that, just like in the briefest chronological outline, you've kind of picked at pieces of it, but could you just in one straight shot show us kind of like how exactly did, you don't have to go all the way back to humors and, early Aristotelian climatology or anything, but
Yeah.
just how exactly this innate difference, this idea lodged itself in the technical device of the spirometer to measure lung function and stayed with us, just so we understand the whole picture here.
Well, the only dimensions of humans that are lodged into this barometer are race and gender sex. But so those are the two, and in in the most of the development of the spirometer innovation, technological innovation, took place in the UK, in England, in the hands of Jonathan Hutchinson. But he was fascinated with the device. There was interest in precision instrumentation in London at that time, particularly. So he presumably collaborated with instrument makers. I know many people working on spirometry later did collaborate with instrument makers. He disappeared into Australia, and so has found really good materials on him since. But he published in a short period of time, 1840s to 1852, I believe, and on the instrument, and held testimonials in London at societies. It was really fascinating to see sort of how he looked at the spirometer and how he promoted it really avidly. He was a physician and what we would call now probably a pulmonologist. He worked at Brompton Hospital, and he was interested in really two things: how could this barometer be used to diagnose disease, particularly tuberculosis, which was so critical at that time. It never did pan out as a diagnostic tool for tuberculosis, but he was also interested in how could it tell us something about fitness, and police force, various elements of the police forces were important to him. Life insurance he was a life insurance physician, so he was interested, could this tool predict longevity? So he wrote a lot about that. Now because of all that work, he's generally credited as being the inventor of the spirometer. But Charles Thackeray had also used the spirometer, at least. I don't have evidence of who built the spirometer, but the spirometer was around earlier in the hands of Charles Thackeray, who was an occupational physician. So he was interested in how did it affect people working in different occupations. Certainly instruments somewhat akin to the spirometer were used to study lung physiology, lung anatomy, breathing, lung chemistry, etc., for quite a long time. I mean, centuries really. But we don't. Hutchinson was really the first one to apply it in a way on large populations, and his populations were large, like 4,000 people at that time. If you think all the tracings that are involved and the calculations, he was doing all that by hand on 4,000 people.
And this is in England?
This is in England.
So a different kind of population. And how did he transpose from that kind of less racialized environment to the racialized environment of the Americas?
Yeah, so what I think is important is in England, they were looking at occupation and class, sort of occupation as a crude measure of class. So Hutchison was organizing his data, but in a different way than would come to be the case in the US.
Mm.
So that's, you can see some of the tables in his work are various categories of work. And then he also had a category of girls, a few girls, and then he made conclusions based on this little sample. But the work he was doing went transnational almost immediately. It was picked up in Germany. And I want to emphasize at this point that my study is of the English language literature. So I think probably there's a very different history, actually, that you could look at in Germany. But it went transnational fast, and including across the Atlantic. And there, it looks as though Cartwright was the person that really used this instrument. I mean, there was some use of it in the North, but he used it to study race. So he becomes very significant in this history. And then I think it's Gould who made it much more legible, much more scientific, the idea of racial difference. Mm. And but the important thing here is at this moment, is after Frederick Hoffman in particular, it was contested by Kelly Miller and W.E.B. Du Bois in different publications. Kelly Miller wrote a scathing review of Frederick Hoffman's book. And so at that moment, it was seen by African-American scholars to be something important to contest. And they did. But it kept circulating in science. You can see it in all medical journals, that papers referring to it. But it didn't then become really concretized or solidified until the 1922 paper by Wilson and Edwards, where they developed standards in children. And from then on, it had a life of its own. I track in the paper when race was measured in papers. And so the 1920s was a decade where it was very important. Then it sort of disappeared in the US and came back with a vengeance in the 60s. So, that raises interesting questions about, is this really a new moment in racial science, or is it what Troy Duster refers to as buried alive?
And so it comes back to the US or comes back with this renewed racial vigor, and it ceases being kind of a measurement device and starts being, it ceases being so much about measurement and becomes more about like comparative norms and creating differences that are predictable in some way. What happens after the 60s?
In the 60s, it continues with the publications increase. It continues. I don't think it ever really disappeared. So I don't think it so much came back, although I do think the fact that it was picked up in India and in particular sort of made it more credible. But this is really a story of race and the US, white supremacy and the US. That's what this is about, because the measurements, and I don't think you can really separate out, the measures, because those measurements are hierarchical. They remain hierarchical. Nobody except for Du Bois and then later Johnny Myers ever raised questions about this, which is phenomenal. So it was utterly, utterly normative, but it was a measuring device in the clinic. It was very, very important, remains important.
And so how is it used as a technical device? If we could just kind of switch to talking about the spirometer itself, how is it used to control populations? Like your title from Plantation to genetics, we'll get to the genetics part at the end of our interview, but how is it used to control populations?
Well, I think, that's, I guess that the language of controlling populations would be a hard argument to make outside of an STS circle. Maybe that's going to be, it'll be easier to start to see surveillance and what role surveillance plays given the current moment, where COVID and protest against anti-Black racism is it's really that they're converging. And so there is attention to surveillance, but the idea that this is a surveillance device of populations is a hard argument to make. So what I really tried to set up in the book is if it's racializing, it's conveying something about people of African descent in very subtle ways. For lung capacity, it's primarily going to the physician or the providers or the technicians who do, because they're the ones that see this. Patients don't really see it. For glomerular filtration rate, which I've done a lot of work on and have a paper under review on, and it's actually quite different because the correction factor goes out to every patient in a portal. So there, I think you're really conveying something about difference to a larger group of people. So controlling, I guess I look at it as shaping our ideas about difference in a way that is embedded in science, and so it has the authority of science.
Yeah, it legitimates it in a way.
Absolutely.
That's a fascinating kind of story. And we'll get to in our last question how to deal with our society full of these seemingly subtle legitimations of old racial science. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you, since this is technology storytellers, what approaches or concepts from the history of science and technology have been useful for wrapping this complex story together for you? Because you don't come from a history of technology or history of science or STS space originally, and you're kind of perhaps a convert. So if you could evangelize a little bit about what was useful for you from those fields for putting this all together.
Well, I did when Ann Foster Sterling organized an STS group at Brown, I guess back around 1999. She, at the same time, organized a seminar where a group of us met for years and years on a monthly basis, and we read key texts in STS. So we read, obviously, Foucault, we read Donna Haraway, we read classic Sandra Harding, classic figures in STS. I was drawn, and what was particularly useful to me in this project was I was drawn at the questions about knowledge production that STS raised, and that are not as easily raised in other fields. Now, the other, as I mentioned, I joined Africana Studies, and so at that time, I was also reading a lot in the Black radical tradition. And so those two things were completely intertwined intellectually for me at the moment.
And you said something really interesting about getting it out of the machine. And for our last question, I want to ask you, how we deal with what I call the accumulatory problem of history is that we have old social systems which work with present technical inventions and ideas to kind of, like we were talking about earlier, stabilize, concretize things that we might not agree with, things that are kind of, from one perspective, like some of Foster Sterling's work, not logical within their own their own workings,
Mhm.
and we just have this historical strata lodged full of many things like the spirometer, many things with implicit racial bias or explicit measurement factors in our society, which are used, and as you so well put earlier, not necessarily control our populations, but measure them and produce normative boundaries and hierarchies of function and measurement. And I'd like to ask you in this last question, how do we get race out of this barometer? And generally, what are your thoughts on dealing with getting rid of race in all these many manifold ways that it could be nestled in our society, in professions of measurement or expertises that are meant to generate useful knowledge?
So on the one hand, we don't want to use race in the way we've been using race, which is really about innate difference. That's sort of what undergirds almost most of the ways in which we use race. We want to think about the social dimensions of race and especially racism. So for spirometry, personally, I don't think we should race correct. I think there's no way to race correct without the notion that race is a defined entity and that groups are homogeneous. And really, I think in medicine, we treat white people as more individualized, and then we homogenize, particularly people of African descent. So I think there's the other issue, and this is a hard sell, but is the spirometer, can the spirometer do the work it's being made to do? So that's an STSE question, and I've always liked that as some sort of resolution. I think the way we're using it is flawed. And because it's inherent that you have to compare an individual to population, so you have to define a population, no matter how your correction is working, whether it's working through a scaling factor, whether it's working through population-specific standards. You have to the population has to be fairly homogeneous. And so what I think spirometry could be useful for is longitudinally. Someone with, any of a large number of respiratory diseases, follow them over time. You need a different kind of health system to do that. But just because we don't have that health system, we don't want to substitute a particular usage of the spirometer that I think is deeply flawed. So I think there are uses for this instrument, but in individuals, using the individual baseline. They do that essentially in mines, for example. It's pretty gross, but they collect spirometry measurements and then watch people's lung function deteriorate with time in the mind. I find that just like pretty hideous, but that is a longitudinal use. Now, the other thing, when I was in South Africa, in some settings, usually in settings where people are more acknowledge the problematic use of race, they disable race correction. But I have never heard of race correction being disabled in the US, but it can. Now, some would argue, well, then you wouldn't really know about the physiological effects on the lungs of, let's say, pollution, the environment, on the lungs of people of African descent. But we're not getting that information now with race correction. So what is the information you're going to get, and is it reproducing inferiority, superiority, etc.? And is it diverting attention from doing something about pollution,
Yeah,
for example?
and your answers pleasantly internalist and externalist, which is an interesting thing with critiques of race. You know, you're both coming from a position that this technology doesn't do the work it's supposed to, and it doesn't do it well. It could do it in another way, and that it might be masking larger systematic structures, and those structures might be valuable enough to just cease the use of.
I mean, that is sort of where I've come, because I have been asked that question. And at first, I just was obsessed with getting the history as right as one could get it. And then, but I simultaneously had to really think about, how are we using this instrument? And could we use it differently?
And before we exit here, would you say that that's kind of how we need to critically, that's almost a Harawaiian approach. We need to situate our technical devices and situate our ideas, and the work has just begun. There's no simple solution. It's for academics, it's for activists, it's for the general population to critically engage with ideas and technology.
Absolutely. I mean, I was incredibly influenced by her work from the very beginning, even if I had to read it slowly. But I absolutely think that is how we have to reflect on technologies like the spirometer, and also, I don't think we always need to do research. And you can see this with COVID. A lot of the research is not all that useful, that is getting rushed out. So, we can also think, we know a lot now. We know what that pollution damages lung function. There's really lots of strong studies demonstrating that. And we know that different minority groups, in particular African Americans, but not exclusively, live close to polluted areas. They live close to toxic dumps. We've known that. I mean, Robert Bullitt wrote his book, long ago. It's like, we don't really need more research. We need to do something.
Wow. A call to action from Lundy Braun, the historian and pathology and laboratory science and Africana studies professor at Brown University. Thank you so much for coming on to Technology Storytellers. It was just a fascinating conversation, and I hope to read more of your work in the future.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed the conversation a lot.